Recently, I discovered there was a problem with the way that we tested PCIe 4.0 SSDs, and I'm going to explain what that screw up was and why it may or may not matter. SSD reviews are one of the main things that we do here at Silicon Insights, and while they aren't as glamorous as CPU or GPU reviews, personally, I really enjoy doing them. It's been one of my main things since 2023, and I've gotten pretty decent at it. Anyone familiar with testing SSDs knows that there are many factors that can impact performance. For example, the CPU. The CPU has a big impact on the performance of any storage device, and although the 1400K is getting up in its years, it's technically a 2-year-old or so chip at this point. We still actually use it for SSD testing because it's actually the best one out there. The way we test SSDs depends on what kind we have in the first place, PCIe 4.0 versus PCIe 5.0. On the Z790 Taichi Lite motherboard, which we use with the Core i9 1400K to test our SSDs, there's only one M.2 slot with PCIe 5.0 support, so any PCIe 5.0 SSDs we have, well, we necessarily test it in that slot. As for PCIe 4.0 SSDs, we actually have 4 other slots that we can use, but not all of them are the same. One of them hooks directly into the CPU, while the other 3 are connected to the chipset, which is then connected to the CPU. And just as a side note, the M.2 slot with PCIe 5.0 support also gets its lanes from the CPU. In fact, that's pretty much a requirement because there's no chipset out there that comes with PCIe 5.0 lanes. They just go up to PCIe 4.0. Now, in theory, the CPU lanes and the chipset lanes are the same as long as they're the same version. However, if you're connecting the storage device to the chipset, that is an extra hoop it has to jump through in order to get to the CPU. Despite that, we've been using the chipset slots rather than the single CPU slot on our test bench, largely for convenience. This is largely because we can test multiple PCIe 4.0 SSDs at a time if we use the chipset slot. This saves a ton of time and it's way less annoying. The general rule of thumb among SSD enthusiasts is that if you want your storage to be the fastest, you connect it to the CPU rather than the chipset. And I'm sure SSD enthusiasts are thinking right now that our testing data must be garbage because we've made a very terrible mistake. But that being said, there's very little data out there that suggests one way or another if chipsets hurt performance or if it doesn't really matter. Believe me, I looked before I did this video and I found maybe one article from the past year that had even 3 benchmarks to speak of. It's really not looked into very much. After testing a few PCIe 4.0 SSDs lately, it gave me the idea that maybe I should look into this whole chipset thing and see if our testing setup needs an update or if it's just perfectly fine. And after testing this, I realized that I probably should have done this a long time ago. So like normal, we're using our Core i9 1400K test bench with 32GB of DDR5 memory to test this, but we tested Orico's O7000 1TB and Corsair's MP600 Pro and H2 TB SSDs in the CPU connected M.2 slot rather than the normal chipset slots that we use. For comparison, we have testing data from the same SSDs, but plugged into the chipset connected slots instead. The chipset slots do use a different heatsink, however, we're pretty confident that doesn't play into the data, since both SSDs were pretty cool regardless of the heatsink. We ran the 2 drives in our usual testing suite of 6 benchmarks. 3 are gaming focused, and the other 3 test transfer speeds under different conditions. Anyways, let's take a look at the data. In 3DMark's storage benchmark, we can already see a pretty substantial difference in performance. Both SSDs are over 20% faster when they're using the M.2 slot connected to the CPU, and while that's not an earth-shattering performance bump, it's not a tiny one either. This was actually the very first benchmark I ran for this video, and at first I thought that all of our PCIe 4.0 SSD reviews were completely worthless. But as we'll see, it's a little bit more complicated than that. Next up, we have the new direct storage test in 3DMark, which shows you how much better your SSD would be in games if it was using direct storage. While both SSDs do show a noticeable performance uplift with the CPU connected slot, it's not a huge difference. It's definitely nothing like what we saw in the regular storage benchmark. But in Final Fantasy XIV's official Dawn Trail benchmark, there's hardly any difference between going through the CPU or the chipset. In fact, the chipset outperformed the CPU here, but this is almost certainly just margin of error stuff and not representative of a real advantage for the chipset. First up in our non-gaming test is Crystal Disk Mark, which tests transfer speeds under a variety of conditions. By default, it's loaded up with 4 different tests, and up first, we're looking at a sequential workload with a queue depth of 1. Performance is higher via the CPU by roughly 3% in reads and 4% in writes, which isn't nothing, but it isn't exactly massive either. But the performance advantage for CPU-enabled drives largely disappears when the queue depth is up to 8. The MP600 is a little slower in reads with the chipset, but it is faster in writes at the same time, so I'd call it a wash. Switching over to the random test with a Q depth of 1, we finally see a big difference between the CPU and the chipset. In reads, the O7000 was 13% faster on the CPU, and the MP600 was 18% faster. Similarly, writing performance was 15% faster with the CPU for the O7000 and 8% for the MP600. But after increasing the Q depth to 32, these performance differences no longer exist. You can probably start to notice the pattern here. We use Disbench to move the Witcher 3 game files from one folder on an SSD to another, which forces simultaneous reading and writing, something that's both fairly intensive and fairly realistic. Not really much to comment on here. The performance is pretty much the same on both the CPU and the chipset. Lastly, we have Iometer, which we've configured to run a continuous writing operation on our SSDs. We've loaded our SSDs up to 3 different levels: 10% full, 50%, and 90%. Writing performance declines the more a drive is full, so we can get a clear picture of an SSD's writing limitations with Iometer. Nothing really jumps out here in the 10% filled results, except for some reason the MP600 is doing slightly better through the chipset rather than the SSD, but I think this is probably just a testing quirk. I wouldn't read too deeply into it. The averages here are pretty much what we'd expect to see based on the chart, so there's not a ton to talk about. With 50% of the capacity taken up, both the CPU and chipset results are pretty similar once again. The MP600 through the chipset does hold its boost for a little longer than it did with the CPU. Meanwhile, the CPU-powered O7000 wrote much faster than it did under the chipset up until the 4-minute mark. So there's a win for both the CPU and the chipset here, but I'm probably going to chalk this up to testing variances for reasons I'll explain later. Very little difference between our SSDs here, minus the MP600 under the CPU seeing a longer boost period than under the chipset, the opposite from last time. There's a very small difference between the two MP600 results, while the O7000 figures are practically identical. Okay, so we did see some performance differences there, and on the whole, performance with the CPU was much better than with the chipset. However, it really depends on what benchmark you're looking at. Most of the benchmarks didn't show a performance difference at all. It was really only 3D Mark and 2 of the Crystal Disk Mark tests that showed a performance difference. The data we got from Crystal Disk Mark is particularly useful in understanding what's going on with the data. In the higher Q depth test, it didn't matter if the SSD was hooked up to the CPU or the chipset, but at a Q depth of 1, it absolutely mattered. And intuitively, that makes lots of sense. At lower Q depths, latency starts to be a more significant factor since the flow of data is reduced. If there's less data coming through in bulk, the time to receive data becomes much more relevant. Taking a detour through the chipset will obviously increase latency, and if you can't have a high Q depth to make up for that, well, it's going to reduce performance. We especially see this in the random single Q depth test. Crystal Disk Mark also showed a more pronounced performance loss in the random test versus the sequential test, but I'm not sure if that's because of randomness versus sequentialness, because the random test also uses a much lower block size than the sequential test, so it might be down to that. I could have tested this a little bit more, but I'll be honest, I didn't really have a ton of time to. Though that might not matter too much anyways, because in the real world, random workloads tend to skew towards lower block sizes, and sequential workloads tend to skew towards larger block sizes. And with all that in mind, the big performance differences that we saw in the regular 3D Mark storage benchmark start to make a lot more sense because games do call for these random low Q depth operations. As for the direct storage test, well, one of the main innovations of direct storage is raising the Q depth that SSDs have access to in games. So that kind of explains why the performance difference there isn't quite as big as the one that we saw in the regular storage benchmark. So as far as I can tell, any performance difference in storage connected to the CPU versus connected to the chipset is really only going to apply in these low Q depth type of workloads. Maybe also randomness has something to do with it, or block size, but it seems to be mainly connected to the Q depth. With all that being said, the general wisdom of storage being slowed down by chipsets is actually true, but I was kind of surprised of how little the performance difference was. It kind of puts us in this really annoying middle ground, where for most of our PCI 4.0 SSDs, the testing data is perfectly fine. It isn't impacted by this chipset performance loss, but even the data that is impacted, well, the performance loss isn't even that big to begin with. That being said, going forward, we are definitely going to be testing PCIe 4.0 SSDs with the CPU slot rather than the chipset slot, because we just want to see how fast these SSDs can truly be when they are at their best. And honestly, I'm just glad the performance difference isn't super big. I mean, when I saw those 3D Mark results, I thought that our previous reviews were going to be completely garbage and that we'd have to redo them or take them down or like add some kind of footnote in the description or the comments. It was very bad. But once I saw like Disbench and stuff, I was like, oh, okay. So there is a difference. It's just like not a gargantuan difference. You're probably also wondering what this means for you and whether you should prioritize putting your SSDs in the CPU connected slot versus the chipset connected slot, and whether you should even bother with storage if you have to put it in the chipset slot if you run out of those CPU connected slots. Now personally, I don't think really anyone's gonna notice the performance difference between the CPU and the chipset for their storage unless they go out looking for it. I mean, it's just so small. Even in 3D Mark, I mean, a 20% difference isn't all that big. I mean, especially for storage, it's not like your frame rate is tied to your storage speed. Though I will say you should probably put your OS drive into a CPU connected slot because, well, I mean, it's just good for your OS drive to be as fast as it can possibly be, given that, well, that's where your operating system exists. Anyways, that's all I got for you. If you enjoyed our testing and analysis, then please like the video, comment, subscribe, and ring the bell icon to get notified the next time we upload. If you really like what we do here at SI, then please consider donating to our Patreon so that we don't go bust. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.